Welcome, Wagga Wagga, to an evening with Clive Hamilton. My name's Mark Evans, and I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Charles Sturt University, and I'm your host for this evening's event. Let me begin by inviting Aunt Cheryl Penrith to give a welcome to country.
Yuridu Marang, Nadu, Cheryl Penrith, Warachina, Gawayambana. G'day everybody, my name's Cheryl Penrith, I'm a Wiradjuri woman. Welcome to our Wiradjuri country, welcome to Wagga Wagga. Our welcome to country is an important protocol practiced by Wiradjuri people for thousands of years. As Wiradjuri people, we are responsible for you or your own country. A welcome to country comes with an expectation that while you're on country that you will take care of yourself and take care of country. A really important value for Wiradjuri people is Yinjamara, which is respect. Respect for yourself, respect for other people and respect for country. I think that Yinjamara, when we talk about place, where we are here right on the Murrumbidgee River, which at the moment is in flood, which for November is really unusual, and all of this rain that we've had, and before that we've had a bushfire, and even last year we had that earthquake that was here in Wagga. So I think country is really telling us that there is something really wrong. So I would like to acknowledge elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge other First Nations people that are here. I'd like to welcome first-time visitors here to Wagga and welcome everybody here. When I do a welcome to country, I think about the things that we can do today and how that's going to have some impact on the generations of all of our young ones and our community, and what we can do today and what impact we can have today that's going to be a legacy for our young people into the future. Wagga Wagga is the true Wiradjuri name for Wagga Wagga is a place of big celebration and dance, and I think every time we come together to yarn, to talk through things, I think that's a celebration. I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. Gawayambana, welcome everybody to Wiradjuri country. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie Cheryl, for that heartfelt welcome to country. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people as the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting this evening. And I'd like to recognise their unique contribution to our environmental and cultural heritage, past, present and future. And I would like to extend my respect to all Wiradjuri people and their elders in attendance here this evening. Can I also provide a very special welcome to Councillor Jenny McKinnon, the Deputy Mayor of the City of Wagga Wagga, Michelle Crosby, our new Chief Operating Officer at Charles Sturt University, our Head of Government Relations, Sam Beresford, and the Director of the Agri Park, Marcus Kennedy. And a very big thank you to all our partners, the City of Wagga Wagga Council, the Royal Society of New South Wales, and the Committee for Wagga for their support for this event. It's wonderful to see so many members of the Wagga community and the extended Charles Sturt University family with us here this evening, both live and virtually. There's over 100 people registered online for this event. Staff, students, collaborators and friends from our communities to engage with Clive Hamilton's key propositions in his book, Defiant Earth. Now, you are able to also join this conversation online, both here at the Playhouse and virtually using Slido.com. So join the conversation Slido.com on your technology of choice via the event code CSU-CH. CSU-CH. Now, this evening's proceedings are organised into two parts. We'll first invite Clive to present his central arguments on how we understand the state we're in. As Cheryl sketched out for us, there is certainly some significant issues that we are confronting with climate at the moment, if not for the last 2 decades at least. And then we'll invite Charles Sturt's Professor Sue Green and Ed Maher to join Clive for a panel discussion, which I'll facilitate. And we'll take questions from our live and online audience through Slido. Now, I now have the great pleasure of introducing tonight's keynote speaker, Charles Sturt's Professor of Public Ethics, Professor Clive Hamilton. On the cover of his latest book, which I'm about 3/4 of the way through, but I'm really enjoying, the book is called Provocateur, A Life of Ideals in Action, Ideas in Action. And we are told, I quote, "From why climate change matters and how we understand ourselves as Australians, to the dangers posed to us by new authoritarianism, all this and more has been shaped for better or for worse by public researchers and writers such as Clive Hamilton. He's been denounced in federal parliament, declared an enemy of the state by the Chinese Communist Party, and sued by an angry corporation. He's received death threats and taken a crash course in counter-surveillance techniques. But he has also influenced the quality of the air Australians breathe, the cost of our education, and how we see Australia's place in the world. Crucially, his work in establishing the Australia Institute and his powerful advocacy in his books Requiem for a Species, Silent Invasion, and Defiant Earth, amongst many others, all show why questioning the status quo matters, and how powerful arguments can change the world for the better. To be frank, we don't have enough Clive Hamiltons in Australia standing up for the powerless against the powerful and ensuring that the big issues of our time are debated thoroughly in the court of public opinion. Everybody, I give you Clive Hamilton.
Thank you, Mark, for that fabulous introduction. And I want to thank the CSU event organisers who've done a brilliant job getting us all here tonight. And of course, I want to thank Auntie Cheryl for that very warm welcome to country. What is man? It's an old-fashioned question, and not just for its gendered phrasing. In the early decades of the 20th century, the question was debated among thinkers of various kinds. Perhaps that question is no longer posed because asking what is common to humankind inevitably picks a fight with those who insist on the uniqueness of cultural and other kinds of identities. My contention is that the arrival of the Anthropocene forces this question on us once again. The advent of the Anthropocene, I'll suggest, is not only a rupture in Earth history, but in fact the most profound event in human history. Earth system scientists tell us that human beings have become a force of nature, comparable with other forces of nature, like shifting tectonic plates, volcanism, and changes in solar intensity, forces that over billions of years have shaped the Earth's biogeological evolution. Now, if that's so, that we have become a force of nature, then we're no longer the creature we imagined ourselves to be after the Enlightenment. Even at an emotional level, it seems legitimate to gaze at the extraordinary destruction that has been wrought on this planet and ask what kind of creature would allow this state of affairs. I want to suggest this evening that everyone who participates in the fractious debate about where the world is going under the climate crisis brings to it, usually only implicitly, an answer to the question, what is the human being? Yet, for each of us who engage or think about this, there are some hard questions to answer. Are humans the special creature, or are we merely one species entangled or embedded in a network of many others? If we are embedded in ecological networks, how must we rethink the notion of human agency or free will? Are humans to be understood primarily in terms of our differences in ethnicity, culture, and so on? Or is it more helpful to think of humans as a species with a shared habitat, a common biology, or even some kind of transcendental destiny? Is it still tenable to conceive of the human project as one of progress and self-liberation? Or must we now conceive of humans in the context of our decline, even our extinction, possibly this century? What is the appropriate mood, finally, in the Anthropocene? Confidence or anxiety? Faith in humanity or despair about our future? As the tragic fallen species or as the rising gods? One thing seems clear from the contemporary debate: each answer to the question, what is the human being, also implies an answer to the obverse question, what is nature, or what is the earth? So what is the Anthropocene? Well, it refers to a shift in the functioning of the Earth system as a whole, the Earth system as a whole. It refers not only to the disruption of the atmosphere due to anthropogenic warming, but to the flow-on effects, the disruption of the system of the whole, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, or the icy parts, and the lithosphere, the Earth's crust, as well as the atmosphere. So the Anthropocene is much bigger than changes to the landscape or the environment or ecosystems. In fact, the term Anthropocene was coined in the year 2000 to capture a very recent change in the impact of humanity on the Earth as a whole. An impact of a kind and on a scale sufficient to shift the geological evolution of the planet itself. That is, to change the functioning of the Earth system. According to the Anthropocene Working Group, the scientific authority on the subject, the Earth has warmed very gradually under human influence since coal replaced wood as a primary energy source in the late 18th century, but it began to change the functioning of the Earth system only after the end of the Second World War, so from the early 1950s, say, which a period that coincided with the extraordinary rapid increase in resource consumption and waste and human population growth that is known as the Great Acceleration. The Anthropocene brings to an end the 10,000 years of the Holocene, the previous geological epoch, which, as you can see from this chart right at the very end, that little squiggly bit on the right-hand side, that's the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, the epoch which arrived, which was marked by climatic conditions that were stable enough and warm enough to permit the emergence of settled agriculture and therefore civilization as we know it. So let's think about what that means. For the first 4.5 billion years of the planet's history, the evolution of the Earth was driven by the blind forces of nature. Now, the Earth system scientists are telling us that a new force of nature has emerged, technologically empowered humans, one that has shifted the biogeological state of the Earth into a new geological epoch, or even an era, a much more substantial change in that geological division. It's important to recognise, I think, very important, and this is one of the essential starting points of defiant Earth, the two essential claims of Earth system science. On the one hand, the science tells us that humans have become so powerful that we now rival the great forces of nature. On the other hand, the forces of nature have become roused from their 10,000-year Holocene slumber, becoming more dangerous and more uncontrollable, a fact that we've witnessed around the world in recent years with extreme events like fires, heat waves, and of course, in Australia this year, floods. These new facts challenge critics of the idea that humans occupy a special place on Earth, that is, critics of anthropocentrism. We have to distinguish between human-centeredness as a scientific fact and human-centeredness as a moral claim to dominion over the Earth. If human specialness is not so easy to justify in moral terms, although some still do, of course, the earth-shaking power of human beings must be accepted. So the present decades mark a transition in which Earth's biogeological history itself enters a new phase. In a pithy summary of the new relationship, four leading Anthropocene scientists wrote that natural forces and human forces have become intertwined so that the fate of one determines the fate of the other. If humans have become a force of nature, akin to volcanism or meteor strikes, what does it mean for us to become a planetary agent of change? None of our previous theories or narratives of the human as the social-only being seems to work anymore. We have to rethink ourselves and our relationship to the planet on which we live. All of this presents a radical challenge to all previous social science thinking, which has always, or almost always, confined itself to the world of human affairs, classes, elites, capitalism, colonialism, globalisation, rather than to the planet. As the historian Dipesh Chakrabarty, based in the University of Chicago, but in fact an Australian, as Chakrabarty has written, the globe of globalisation is not the globe of global warming. One is a narrative of humans spreading their links across the world. The other is a story about the planet operating under the same laws as every other planet. This new fact changes the way we think about humans. Traditional ways, that is European traditional ways of seeing humans as the product of social forces, can't capture the idea of humans as a planetary force. So we now have to locate humans not just in recorded time, in historical time, but also in deep time, the same kind of time in which other forces of nature have to be understood. Dipesh Chakrabarty famously observed that the arrival of the Anthropocene means that human history and geological history have collided, something unthinkable since the discovery of geological time in the early 19th century, the discovery of geological time that allowed the extraction of human history from the divine realm and its reconstitution as a purely human affair. While scholars of the Anthropocene are divided between those who continue to see humans as products of their differentiated social and economic conditions and locate the problem in capitalist relations and colonialism, and on the other hand, those scholars who maintain that humans should be understood firstly as a collective force of nature, no matter which side they are on, one thing seems very clear. The modern project of progressive self-liberation, permitted by the separation of humans from the natural environment, is difficult to sustain because the disrupted Earth system increasingly comes to dominate daily life through extreme weather events, through collapsing ecosystems, melting ice caps and rising sea levels. With all of this in mind, let me try to provide an overview of how various schools of thought are responding to the epoch-making challenge of the Anthropocene, and in particular, how they think about the human being. But before I do, as I do, to set the scene with a comment on humanism, which now is increasingly looking very old-fashioned. Although by no means universally accepted, especially outside the West, the image of the human that emerged during the European Enlightenment, subsequently reinforced by the scientific and the industrial revolutions, was one characterised by our autonomy, rationality and creativity. In short, and we were characterised as and acted as independent world-making agents. The modern human managed to separate itself from nature and set itself the task of exercising mastery over the natural world, not least through scientific knowledge itself. For humanism, with its emphasis on self-determining agents whose freedom and well-being lay in their own hands rather than supernatural ones, the Earth provided no more than the inert and passive backdrop to the human drama. On several fronts, the arrival of the Anthropocene appears to present a profound challenge to this Enlightenment conception of the human being. The flourishing of human freedoms through economic expansion and rising living standards has been, at the same time, eroding the environmental foundations on which they were built. Faith in human agency becomes harder to defend in the Anthropocene because we have manifestly failed to use our reason and our knowledge to respond to the overwhelming evidence of the warnings that the scientists have been sending for many years. The collapse of the modern vision of the human being is now widely recognised by thinkers in the social sciences and humanities, and indeed in the wider community. So how have they responded? What are the main competing worldviews that are swirling around? And how do they characterise the human? And so I'm going to talk about 6 of them, the 6 below humanism on that previous list. And I want to point out that this is not an exhaustive list of the 6 that I'll talk about. There are others, but the ones I have picked out are the ones that seem to me to be the main ones in contention, even if none of them in the end prevails. The first I've characterised as biologism, which is still very strong in certain parts of the community, particularly within the scientific community. There's a long line of scientific thinking characterising humans as an animal species subject to the same drives, instincts and constraints as other animals. Think of sociobiology, behaviourism and neuroscience, and books like The Selfish Gene. This thinking tends to deny our agency, our ability to use our reason to shape our circumstances. It's true that the arrival of the Anthropocene proves that humans are not exempt from the laws of nature. Yet Earth system scientists tend to the view that if we had in fact accepted 20 or 30 years ago that we are a species inhabiting a natural system like others and subject to the same laws, albeit with a capacity to partially control our environment, then we would have used our reason and technology to protect ecosystems and ourselves from the ravages of climate change and other environmental problems. But we didn't use our reason, despite the warnings. And we've set in train powerful forces over which we now have limited control. Eco-modernism emerged in the 1990s as a counter to the dominant narrative of environmentalism. It rejects criticism of technology, capitalism, overconsumption, economic growth, and failure of the political system. It sees history as an ineluctable, if uneven, journey from poverty, violence, and domination towards an enlightened, prosperous world of liberal democracy. Eco-modernists believe that, quote, humanity is a force for good. This, of course, is a political position consistent with the prevailing system. It has implicit faith, actually explicit faith, in the power of technology to overcome the damaging side effects of progress on the environment. And these techno-fixes justify defence of the prevailing economic system as the one uniquely suited to respond effectively to problems like climate change. Technology permits the decoupling of human progress, GDP growth, from environmental destruction, overcoming the limits to endless growth by finding new and less damaging ways to satisfy expanding human desires and larger populations. Eco-modernists accept that the Earth is an increasingly humanised planet. In fact, they find a positive vision for the future in the humanisation of the Earth. They use the phrase, the good Anthropocene. The mood of eco-modernism is optimistic, even hubristic, as in Mark Linus's declaration that we are the God species. There's a variant of eco-modernism that I call anxious eco-modernism. Unlike their confident cousins, anxious eco-modernists have lost faith in the ability of the political economic system to reduce emissions and other problems fast enough to avoid catastrophic warming. However, they continue to hope that radical technological solutions will succeed where politics have failed. One is engineering the planet by controlling the amount of solar radiation, solar geoengineering falling on the planet, installing, in effect, by coating the Earth in a layer of sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere, installing, in effect, a planetary thermostat. Who's going to have their hand on the thermostat? So solar radiation management is one grand technological scheme. Another is to escape Earth altogether. Space colonisation and terraforming is perhaps the grandest expression of faith in the technological capacity of humans. Over the last decade, the idea has attracted some powerful new recruits, billionaires such as Elon Musk, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, who've been investing heavily in private space travel. It certainly has a kind of messianic quality to it. Elon Musk is confident he can create what he calls a self-sustaining civilization on Mars in the next few years. His ambition is to see humans become, quote, a multi-planet species in a spacefaring civilization. And he's investing billions of dollars in it to prove it. However, in his candid moments, Elon Musk admits to feeling terrified and depressed about where the world is headed. He believes, in fact, that we are facing the end of the world. He wants to go on an adventure and to save civilization. In an influential intervention, Dipesh Chakrabarty, again, has presented a stark challenge to those who say the problem can be understood only by studying capitalism, colonialism and globalisation. Some scholars of the Anthropocene on the left have said it's a colonialist or anthropocentric, to use this phrase, Anthropocene. It should be called the Capitalocene. And I've come up with a whole bunch of other alternatives, as if it shouldn't be stratigraphers who name the geological divisions of the Earth, but human geologists at NYU or whatever. So Chakrabarty himself is a post-colonial historian of Indian origin, of course, and with very much roots in the left. And he's argued that the arrival of the Anthropocene means that the history of humans as social products, often divided against each other, has to be supplemented, not replaced, but supplemented with a history of the species as a whole, species understood as a form of life. Anthropogenic climate change is deeply implicated in the history of capitalism, or rather, since socialist societies have been just as destructive of the natural environment, the history of industrial society. But he says working with the notion of species allows us to embed our understanding in planetary processes, in deep time, before capitalism and after capitalism. So the climate crisis has forced upon us a new awareness of the conditions of life. The threat makes no distinction between the kinds of societies that currently exist or might exist in the future. And the impacts are impervious to the kinds of identities we personally might construct for ourselves based on our ethnicity, gender, class, or whatever. In the last analysis, none of that matters. In the last analysis, yes, wealthy people in wealthy societies will be able to stave off some of the effects for a while, but in the end, the forces of nature will prevail. So in this view, we must go beyond traditional social science conceptions of the human as a social and cultural product made in historical time and locate ourselves as a species within geological time as an earth-changing force. Posthumanism, also known as the new materialism, is inspired by a deep hostility towards anthropocentrism, the actual or moral claim that human beings have over the earth. It insists that for all of the modern human sophisticated theories of the subject and our ambitions for mastery over the environment, human beings remain embedded, entangled, affiliated and networked into the natural world. It challenges human chauvinism by proving the hollowness of claims to human uniqueness and power over nature. Posthumanism takes agency away from humans and distributes it throughout the natural world. Anat Singh, a disciple of Donna Haraway, is determined to cut humans down to size, arguing that the belief in human exceptionalism blinds us to our interdependence with other species. She proposes a human nature in constant historical flux, depending not so much on intra-human social change, but on our relationship with other species, going so far as to propose that, quote, human nature is an interspecies relationship. So in this view, humans become nothing special, just another creature defined by its relationships with the natural world. In my view, there's a certain irony in this attempt to deflate or dethrone humans at the very historical juncture at which human agency has never been more evident or more powerful. We are so powerful that we've changed the geological trajectory of the planet. Yet for posthumanists, the Anthropocene proves the absence of boundaries between nature and society and the futility of the mastery project. Yet the future of the planet, including the future of many forms of life, is now contingent on the decisions made by technologically turbocharged humans. Every scientific study that corroborates human disturbance of the Earth system confirms the idea that human beings occupy a special place among life on the planet. What I call existential defeatism is common in vernacular reactions to the climate crisis. The narrative, apparent in thousands of comments in response to newspaper articles or Twitter posts, follows two broad lines. One, imbued with a sense of tragedy and anger, goes like this. Yes, we're screwed. We deserve what's coming. We were warned and did nothing. Our political and economic systems are corrupt and unconcerned, so what else could be expected than eventual collapse? In fact, collapse coming quite soon, probably. This argument tends to reflect a view of humans as modernist but failed, either because capitalism is inherently rapacious or because humans are greedy, ignorant and concerned only with consuming more. A second narrative within existential defeatism runs like this. There's nothing special about us. Humans are just another species. Species come and go, so why does it matter if humans disappear? It's just nature running its course. I'm sure you've all read this kind of argument on your Twitter feeds or beneath a story in The Guardian about the latest scientific study of climate change. Sometimes this sentiment is augmented with a comment on the behaviour of the Earth, such as, we're only seeing Mother Nature fighting back. This is Gaia's revenge for our mistreatment of it. Speaking of which, the popularity of James Lovelock's story of the human species is attested to by the enormous sales of his books. And he tells a story of the human species emerging through a long series of genetic accidents, multiplying and consuming beyond the planet's capacity, and now soon to be extinguished by an unfeeling Gaia. The cold acceptance of the cancelling out of humankind's immense cultural and intellectual achievements seems to consign the human being to the same realm of meaningless existence as bacteria. Existential defeatism is endemic among Generation Z, those born in the late 90s and early 2000s. A survey of 10,000 young people around the world showed that 56% agree that, quote, humanity is doomed. And the rise of collapsology, as it's called, is another sign, with books on imminent ecological and social collapse selling strongly, not least in France, incidentally. And this fatalistic view, which can be seen as perhaps a psychological coping strategy, it's pretty seductive actually. This fatalistic view has received some pushback from more optimistic people, eco-modernists and others, who characterise those putting these views as doomers. So to finish then, I haven't mentioned, as I've said, various other views, which are certainly current but not as prominent perhaps. But what I've outlined is enough to tell you that sharply different divergent conceptions of the human being are now contesting one another in our radically new circumstances. Broadly, I think, looking at it a slightly different way, there are two kinds of strategies that different schools of thought adopt to think about the human being and our responses to the ecological crisis. Some zoom out and look upon the humans as a species in the sweep of planetary change, natural history and even the cosmos. Others zoom in to focus on the conflicts, divisions, social structure and institutions that we have built and which are clearly failing us. Still others take the view that while never losing sight of the social and economic forces that have created the conditions of the Anthropocene, the crisis faced by humanity is so vast in scope and deep in time that we can only understand it by standing outside the daily struggles among competing groups. Wherever we stand, to have a clear conception of the human being, we have to grapple with the questions that I've broached in this lecture. Are we defined by our commonality or by our differences? Or does the answer depend on the question being asked? Are we a powerful being able to chart our future, or must we succumb to nature's imperatives, even its retribution? Are we an earth-bound creature, or is our nature cosmological? Do we have a promising future there for the taking, or is our fate now one of struggle and pain? As I wrote in Defiant Earth, and I'll finish on this point, for me the question is not whether human beings stand at the centre of the world, but what kind of human being stands at the centre of the world, and what is the nature of that world. What we do over the next decades will change the functioning of the Earth system, for better or worse, and therefore the planet's geological evolution. The fate of one determines the fate of the other. If, through our actions, the Earth system crosses tipping points and sets off uncontrollable feedback mechanisms, our fate may be sealed. If we decide to protect life on Earth in all its forms, there's a chance that the Earth's rage may be pacified. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive, for a powerful, eloquent, but I guess a tad depressing analysis. So I'm now going to invite Professor Sue Green and Ed Maher to join us on the stage to see if we can inject some glimpses of light for the future in the discussion that follows. Sue is Professor in Indigenous Australian Studies at Charles Sturt. She has an extensive history spanning 20 years in Indigenous higher education across a number of roles, such as student support, teaching and research. She's one of Australia's leading practitioners in community development, empowerment and resilience, and her foremost interest is ensuring that Wiradjuri language and culture underpins all aspects of her personal and professional life. Welcome, Sue. And then we have Ed Maher. Ed is Charles Sturt's Manager of Sustainability. He's responsible for leading the university's progress towards best practice in organisational sustainability. He's a career sustainability practitioner with previous roles at Sydney Water Corporation and Snowy Hydro. His passion in this area extends to volunteer and community work, which has led to recognition at state and local levels. Welcome, Ed. So let me begin by opening up the debate really around, whether it's possible for man or people, kind, to be at one with nature. And I'm going to start with asking Ed, what makes climate change such a wicked problem for society to solve? Is the Anthropocene a symptom of our success or failure as a species?
Thanks, Mark. Before I answer, I'd just like to acknowledge that we're meeting here in Wiradjuri land and pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging as well. Yeah, a lot to answering that question. I think on the first part initially, what makes climate change such a wicked problem? I think certainly Clive has touched on that in some of his slides. I'm probably talking to many people that have considered this themselves. But, I think humanity doesn't typically respond well to slow, progressive, incremental change. And to this point, that's what we've largely seen when it comes to a changing climate. It's not an acute overnight or a week or a year that we've seen huge amounts of change. And on top of that, we've got a lot of natural variability in the systems that we live on and rely upon in Earth. So those factors combined, I think, can challenge people's ability to recognise a changing climate, and certainly opens up the debate around whether or not it's natural variability or a scientific concept. But further to that, as Clive's touched on, the fossil fuels has been the lifeblood, and I guess what's turbocharged a modern Western lifestyle. It's given us the ability to create megacities, to create and sustain modern agricultural systems, and I guess it's also a very common metric when it comes to gauging the success of a nation or a standard of living. It's all been linked to fossil fuel since the Industrial Revolution, its ability to continue to improve what we deem to be our standard of living. And I think to take that away, it challenges business as usual kind of systems, business models, both at a corporation and an individual level. Going to the second question about Anthropocene and whether it's a measure of success or failure as a species, I think Clive's probably challenged my thinking tonight with his presentation. Certainly, I think there's many admirable qualities of humankind, and what we've managed, or what humankind has managed to achieve in its ability to, I guess, occupy some of the most challenging parts of the earth, populate effectively, dominate all living things. But on top of that, we have what I think personally what's very special about humankind is our ability to have empathy, not just towards each other, but to other living things, which is pretty unique, I think, in terms of species. So that, in my mind, creates a moral obligation that, because we are aware of that, that we probably currently, in the trajectory that we're on, that the Anthropocene is an indication of our failure as a species.
Okay, so there's two key arguments there. One is the inability of societies to think long-term, particularly governments. And in fact, the pathology of short-termism in contemporary government, well, particularly in Australia, as largely a function of the 3-year electoral cycle as well. But then you've got kind of a technological determinist type argument there that's given us great progress in certain areas, but diminishing hope in other areas. We have become slaves of technology in many ways. So let's think about this from a slightly different perspective then, Sue. How can understanding and being in country help us to be better stewards of the land, or as Robert Kritzich has put it, good ancestors?
I just want to start by acknowledging Aunty Cheryl and the leadership that she gives within this community, both to Wiradjuri people and other people living here, along with the other elders also here in Wagga Wagga and across Wiradjuri country. I'll pick up from what Ed finished with, is that we have failed. We were given a sacred duty to keep everything in balance. That's what our free will was about, was to keep everything in balance. And not only did we not keep everything else in balance, but we haven't kept ourselves in balance either. We have a great responsibility to country, to the mother that nourishes us. We're not separate from everything else. We are completely dependent upon the environment, the food we eat, the water we drink, the air we breathe. And yet, through our greed, through our behaviour like 2-year-olds on a red cordial high, we just keep taking and taking and taking without considering the consequences of our behaviour. And we have reached this point in time where we do still have left a window to actually turn things around. My concern is are we prepared to turn things around? We need to make a complete change of our lifestyles. And that's where the problem seems to lay, is that we keep trying to find answers to the crises we're experiencing without changing the way we live. We have put man at the centre as the most important thing. We have made man in domination of all else, when we have the responsibility to care for country and to care for all else. Country is the centre, because country is what nourishes us and what gives us life. And until we can accept our place within that system, we will keep making the same mistakes that we have been making for hundreds of years. We need to change our relationship to country, and in that we need to change the way we live.
Really important insights there, and unwittingly the answer also, part of the answer to our first question on Slido, which was from Andrew, who asks, what does Wiradjuri understanding of country and our relationship with country offer us that might reshape our future? So I guess it's how we can use that conception of understanding and being in country to make progress for future generations.
We have to pick up the mantle, that sacred duty we're giving, and start caring for country. Start thinking about the health of country and healing country. So we've got to undo some of the damage we've done. And that's not easy, but it's going to be even harder if we don't do it. And we don't do it now.
So what would you say to the view that's also evident on some of the Slido questions, that in many ways Australia has sat back and watched this occur, that we have not been active in speaking up against these changes, and that what we want is a much more active culture of citizenship? We can't expect politicians always to solve all our problems. We need to be more active as citizens to seize the day and make the change ourselves.
One of the things that we do is we keep giving up our power. We keep giving up our agency, and we also blame everybody else for where we are. Politicians are politicians. We get what we deserve. We vote them in. They behave in a way that they think they need to behave in order to keep being voted in. So if we want to change the politicians, we need to change what we do, because it's up to us who's in those seats of power. The loudest voices get heard. And when we sit back and deny our individual power and agency and say, doesn't matter what I do, then we're as big a problem, if not bigger, than those loud voices who keep pushing this capitalist consumer society we live in. For every person that speaks out, our voices grow, and we can become the loud ones that say enough's enough, and it's time to put country and the healing of country back in the centre.
So we need to exercise our agency.
Totally.
Really important. Tabin poses the question on Slido to Clive, where are we up to with progressing a plan of action to rectify climate consequences, and who are the main drivers of these plans? How can we help?
Thank you for that very hard question. I mean, I remember going to COPs, conferences of parties, 10, 15 years ago, where among environmentalists, with whom obviously I moved, it was kind of, you weren't allowed to talk about adaptation to climate change. You could only talk about mitigation, that is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because back then it was believed that if you start talking about how we can adapt to climate change, then that's a kind of defeatist position. You've accepted that it's going to get bad. No one talks like that anymore. We know we have to adapt to climate change, but there are a couple of things here. One is that it's not a question of undertaking a 10-year program of adapting, changing houses and buildings and all kinds of infrastructure and so on and so forth. It will be a process of continuous adaptation as the intensity of climate impacts grows over the next decades. I mean, the impact of, say, 2 degrees warming, and if we're lucky, we will limit warming to 2 degrees, it will still be visible. It will still be felt in 1,000 years hence. The second point is that with all the floods we've been having lately, I sit there and I don't just sympathise in my living room, I also seethe. Because 15, 20 years ago, there were adaptation experts saying local councils should not allow people to build houses in floodplains. And yet the local councils under pressure from developers allowed it to happen, and now it's all coming home to roost. So there were local politicians who basically put people in harm's way, local politicians who have now retired onto the Gold Coast or wherever local politicians go. Sorry, I shouldn't be, there are some wonderful people in local politics, but I'm thinking of the dodgy ones who gave way to pressure from developers. So you can see we've got a massive problem. It's kind of reorienting the whole infrastructure of the societies that we have created in order to accommodate the changes that we have unleashed in the Earth system.
So Ed, how can technology be an instrument of progressive change in this area?
Technology is certainly a tool, a very important tool that we have at our disposal, and we're going to need every inch of it. I think it needs to be tempered, as Sue's mentioned. To think that technology and only technology holds the key to solving all of our problems, I think, is a bit of a blind hope. And just a couple of examples, I suppose, to illustrate that. Take, for example, a household example, lighting technology. We've moved from halogen downlight to LED technology, which use something like 1/10 of the energy to achieve the same or better outcome. But contrary to that, we have an insatiable desire to continue to improve our perception around our standard of living, our comfort in our home. If you consider the average Australia home and what it has in terms of heating and cooling, the extent of that heating and cooling, it far dwarfs what we've been able to achieve on an average household basis in terms of energy efficiency. So I think ultimately technology will be absolutely a key part of the solution, but there is certainly an element of us needing to make some personal decisions around and driving change through other things, such as challenging business as usual economic models, and I guess what we typically measure as an indication of a nation's or an individual's success.
So it's interesting that around the world at the moment, we're seeing the proliferation of citizens' assemblies in France, in Germany, in the nations of the UK, all coming together to discuss the the impact of climate, and the need to effect deep-rooted change. Why aren't our politicians seizing the day in the same way? Why is it perceived to be such an urgent situation now that parliaments across Europe are devolving responsibility to citizens as a whole, but here we're still waiting for politicians to make the change on our behalf?
That's a question for me as well.
That's all three of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to that wicked problem. It confronts corporations, it confronts individuals. I think there's still a disproportionate amount of power held amongst well, let's be frank, it's middle or retiring age white males, and that needs to continue to be challenged. I think they've had certain life experiences, most of them very fortunate, and they only know what they know. But absolutely, as Sue mentioned, it's incumbent upon all of us to challenge that they're the kinds of people that we want to represent us, and that the decisions that they continue to make and the, I guess, mechanisms that they're using to inform and base their decisions need to change and be challenged. So I wouldn't say that there's total inaction. I think at a state level there's tremendous things happening, and there's some glimmer of hope that at a federal level there will be more change happening. But it is fair to say that we've lost decades achieving not much at all.
That's an interesting observation about whether parliamentarians are genuinely representative of the people. In a survey that we conducted with the Museum of Australian Democracy of over 18,000 young Australians, the number one issue that they wanted to see solved as a matter of the utmost urgency was climate change. Number one issue. And yet when we asked the same to federal politicians, it was way down. Well, it was number 5 on the list. Number 5 on the list. Sue, have you an observation there on how we can get our politicians to take these issues seriously?
Well, it basically comes down to people power. And if we start speaking out as a mass, politicians have to listen. You know, let's not inflate the role of a politician. They're there to be elected. That's their job. Get elected and sit there for as long as you can. And do whatever you need to do to be re-elected. So if we, the people, which democracy is supposed to be about, if we stand together and we say to the politicians, right, what are you going to deliver? We will see a very different outcome to what we currently see.
You need to use Slido, if you could. Look, I'll come back to you later on, but I've got a list of questions from the audience here through Slido. So this is for Clive. In terms of the categories that you presented, which of those categories do you believe align better with the perspectives of First Nations? Or do you think that the understanding country perspective is completely distinctive in its approach?
I thought about this in preparing the lecture. I'm always reluctant to talk about Indigenous views of country because of a lack of expertise. I think it's extraordinarily important. I don't think, and it's kind of a necessary condition for us to respond adequately. But I think, given we've got this vast industrial infrastructure built on fossil fuels and a massive generation of wastes that go into the environment in every place, we need more than that. So I think how it will transpire, I mean, my view is look like this, that bottom line is that ways of understanding the world that of fundamentally understanding the world that then become the dominant, become entrenched in society, social thinking, take a very long time to change. If we think about the emergence of modernism and the conception of the human being I described in the talk, that took perhaps a century to change from essentially a Christian religious perspective. We're talking about Europe. And I think that the ideas, the ontologies, as it were, that is the understanding of humans, what kind of being we are, is something that we can't really see yet. I think it'll probably take decades and thinkers way beyond, certainly the older ones of us here. And so I really don't know what will emerge. But I just want to make one point, because I wanted to follow up on Sue's comment about the loudest voices in democracy, which I think is absolutely spot on. But I also have to say that I'm worried about the quiet voices that have a huge amount of money behind them, that influence our political leaders, so that yes, they do need to be elected, but often the strategy, and this is not all of them, some of them are terrific, but for many of them, and we've seen in recent decade or two, the majority perhaps federally, want to give a pretense of responding to the people, but really responding to powerful money interests.
So I have another question for Clive from on Slido. Clive, given the intrinsic conflict of human populations, do you see the expected emergence of artificial intelligence playing a positive role in human stewardship of the planet?
Oh, look, this is a massive question, which I don't have a particular expertise, but my gut feeling is that AI is one of these technologies that can so easily get out of control and have so many unintended consequences that it's something that, on a very large scale, we will regret.
Thank you, Clive. Andrew, with an observation. Citizens' assemblies reach great aspirational goals, yet run aground when outcomes interact with powerful agents with vested interests. How do we solve this? I don't know if anybody has a response to that question. I guess my observation would be, if we look at the most successful citizen assembly of recent times, which was the Irish Constitutional Convention, the reason why that worked was basically because it was a mix of citizens and politicians. So once recommendations emerged from the Assembly, it was almost impossible for politicians to ignore the outcomes. And that's why the majority of the recommendations from that Assembly ultimately were passed through the legislature. So it's about accountability, I guess. It's about making politicians accountable in public and ensuring that they respond to the needs of their citizenry. Now, this gentleman, could you come up to this microphone and make your point? Because I don't want to be non-participative, but it's you have to use the microphone.
I was trying to get through the other system, but the point was raised here by Sue about Indigenous cultures. We're all indigenous to the planet, at least, if not the Milky Way. So the role of going backwards in a sense, and I noticed some of your questions about degrowth there, and the question about this rain and the floods and the local councils and didn't take notice. We had floods here in 1852 and 1853, and the Wiradjuri people said, don't build on a floodplain. What do we do now? We're quavering with the levee banks to whether they're going to fail or not. So that deep culture, the deep culture of all of us, and yes, we happen to be in Wiradjuri country, and we should be responsible and care for everything in our place, ourselves, in Wiradjuri country at the moment here, no matter what our background is. So I guess the point is, can we not look backwards? I mean, evolutionary history and geology seems always to say, we've got to go forward, we've got to go forward. Why can't we look back to some of the solutions? And what we've lost, Sue mentioned the word sacred twice. No one else has mentioned spirituality, sacredness, higher powers than GDPs and politicians and whatever. There's some forces there. Call them spiritual, call them God, call them Bayami, call them Feroci from South America, whoever, whatever these forces are. We can't just keep challenging those forces with technology and not be run down and lose the plot. Thanks.
Some important points there. We don't learn the lessons from history, do we? Clear observation, collective historical amnesia, particularly from elites. Clive, how can we combat that?
There's so many ways of answering that question. Let me just do one, and that is a perspective that I left out of my 7 is a theological response to the Anthropocene. And probably many people here know that CSU's campus in Canberra is in fact a theological campus. And I work in a building surrounded by, well, several theologians, and we had a number of colloquia which were around Defined Earth, and the theologians, not just at CSU but from around Australia, were prompted to think about the Anthropocene and what a theological response would be. Incidentally, there's a book that's just out with some of the contributions to those colloquia published in the US, but will be available here very soon. And basically, I'm not a Christian, but I'm a fellow traveller. The Christian theological response to the Anthropocene is that we are a fallen creature, and we were always going to bring on the apocalypse, and that's what we've done. Now, the theologians then, well, the Christians then say, well, but we believe that that rebirth is possible. And I think that it actually responds in a way to the question or commentary that our friend made, and that is there is a larger way of understanding what's happening, one actually that I'm quite sympathetic to, not necessarily a Christian theological view, but something like that, about humans on the planet and the role we were put here to perform, and the way in which we failed at the essential task that we were given, which was to care for country, look after the planet, pass it on to future generations in a better condition than the way we found it.
And of course, there is a big history of the use of natural capital from historical methods from First Nations people, but also from other communities that can help us with this. And Jeff Gurr, one of our professors at Orange, is using a whole range of different natural capital techniques to produce much more resilient crops, for example, at the moment. Now, look, we're coming to the end of our time together, so I wanted to ask one final question to each of our panellists. What gives you hope for the future? What gives you hope for the future?
I'll kick that off first, if that's the way we want to run. I think something that I read recently pointed out the distinction between hope and courage. So I think something that gives me hope is that we are seeing increased courage amongst segments of the community and society that is starting to knock at the door at what we've come to know as business as usual models. And that definitely needs to increase at a fairly serious rate. But I think just a couple of, well, one particular example that I've noticed or heard quite recently in mainstream media is around sponsorship in Australian sport. So young athletes that are taking a stand and saying that we're not going to just stand by and happily wear a certain logo on our jersey for the sake of $40 million or whatever it may be. Now, that's a small scale, but I think when we're starting to see that courage amongst normal society, that's a very positive thing. And the other thing I'd like to say is I think current generations, on average, have different models and values to what generations in recent times have had, and I just hope that we can continue to nourish and relish and let that to have a positive impact on future society and generations.
Thank you, Ed. Sue?
I think what gives me hope is the growing number of people who are starting to listen and hear Wiradjuri and other First Peoples around the globe. The fact even here tonight we've talked about the floods. The Wiradjuri people were saying to those ones right from the beginning of those new arrivals, do not build on riverbanks or floodplains. It's taken a couple of 100 years, but it's starting to be heard. We've been saying, do not do hot burns. It damages the environment and sets us up for mega fires. Just now, people are starting to acknowledge that we have to do cool burns and look after the environment that way. The respect that's being shown to our elders and the acknowledgement of our elders and their roles, that our young people are starting to be acknowledged. The Indigenous knowledges are now being acknowledged as not as fantasies or folk tales, but the way we have to live on country. That's what gives me hope.
Thank you.
Well, look, I mean, I'm always suspicious of hope, actually, because it's a very seductive thing. And if it's hope in the abstract, I just hope that everything will be okay, I think that can easily just become wishful thinking. And I think we're beyond wishful thinking. And so I always say to people, well, hope for what? I mean, it's just being hopeful isn't enough. Hope for what? And I think that it's possible to be hopeful that the world will respond, if we're talking about climate change and our passage into the Anthropocene, strongly enough to avoid the worst. So that, yes, it's going to be tough, it's going to be an era of struggle and hardship, more so for some than others, but if we act in the next 10 years or so in a decisive way, we can avoid the worst of it. And then humans are, as we know, very, very adaptable. And I think it's quite possible that in the transformed climate and therefore the transformed earth, which we're moving into, despite all the ravages of floods and fires and the awful things that we have seen happening, that we will learn to live in the Anthropocene in a way that is loving and compassionate and caring for the earth and each other.
Thank you, Clive. A great parting shot there. So key messages: have courage and speak up, listen, understand country, take action and adapt. So look, we've come to the end of our time together. Many thanks to Clive, Sue and Ed for their insightful contributions this evening. Many thanks to our partners, City of Wagga Wagga, the Royal Society of New South Wales and the Committee for Wagga for their support for the event. And also to Sam Bereford's fantastic team for organising the event this evening. But most importantly, many thanks to you, the audience, for your valuable participation. So please join us now for canapés. The bar is open to purchase drinks, and I'm sure you can ask a lot more questions to the panellists. Gateway will be selling signed copies of Clive's Defiant Earth and other books in the foyer. But join us next time as well for an evening with Stan Grant, where he will be talking about the India Mara Pledge for Democracy. Thank you, everybody.